My brother just told me.
Jay, why are we laughing so
How many years, John?
I started teaching Hamlet when Lyndon Johnson was president.
And she says, I met the youthful Lord Paris at Lawrence's cell and gave him what becoming love I might, not overstepping the bounds of modesty.
No, I already did that with the
I
other
should
guy.
say that.
Him and Beowulf and...
But you know, when he dies, he's like desperate to be remembered. Tell my story. Remember me. Should we be doing this? Should we stop right now?
No.
All right, this is going to be really interesting because Paul and I have spent so much time talking about Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet and the Odyssey, God knows, and some other texts. This is the first time we would have spent really serious time on a non-literary. We did do Zadie Smith, and that's sort of, in a way, similar to this more classic version of literary theory, which is William Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads, originally published in 1798. Then, similar to Milton's editing of Paradise Lost, he then added some stuff to it to help him hopefully make it make more sense. So there was an 1800 preface and then a further expanded 1802 preface.
I'm looking at the 1800 preface is the one
I think I am too. Yeah. So Paul and I think we're gonna dig into the text itself, moments that stand out, maybe some tensions or questions. Something that I am really curious about your opinion of, Paul, is for those who have either know Paul and I or have watched any of these, you can only imagine when Paul and I worked together how many hours we spent not doing schoolwork and having conversations like this.
Yeah.
So
got in the way. I always felt like the kids, if they weren't, it would
that's fair.
It's always go to class, grade paper, stuff like that. It's just all that junk.
Yeah. I think similar to like Sidney's Defense of Poesy and this and Coleridge's Biographia Literaria and Pope's essay on criticism, and we could go on and on and on. Oscar Wilde's preface to Dorian Gray, all those little statements. There's so many moments in the history of English literature where brilliant imaginations stop and ask, what are we doing? Yeah. And that's what this is. And I think what I'd love to do at the end, Paul, and I don't want to do it now. I want to talk about the text first, but I want to talk about why it's good for readers or people like high school teachers to stop every once in a while and read literary theory like this.
Yeah.
So
I like that.
Because you and I in college probably had to take literary theory.
Yeah.
And you could make a case that it would be better for English majors to just read more books. I wouldn't really be excited for any of my own kids or any students I care about to be in an undergrad or grad program that's solely focused on literary theory and didn't read enough actual literature.
Yeah.
That's like studying music theory without ever buying a piano. That's, at some point you have to do the thing. But I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, I think so too. And if you have to read it, and you probably should do some literary theory reading, but if you have to do it, I think we should read this. I think we should read the actual artists.
Yeah.
When I read literary theory, I liked it. I enjoyed it at some level, but I thought of it as a whole other thing.
Yeah.
I came to think of it as not even really talking about books. But it was a whole other art form, almost unto itself, which it was easy for me to separate from my actual reading of Shakespeare, Jane Austen, or whatever. It was just this whole other thing, and it was fun. And so far, it was fun. It was entertaining, intermixing of ideas and sociology and history and philosophy and whatever. But its relationship to literature was bleh. I didn't care.
Well, I may have shared this before, and I'll start with our standard poem. But my first day at grad school, I was in a literary theory class, and we had this like humongous German guy as a teacher, and he was really good.
Yeah.
But it was a modern literary theory class, and I was raised in a more formalist sort of landscape. So this was like Swahili to me. And this professor in a German accent I won't attempt said, "What is the purpose of literary theory?" And I naively at 21 raised my hand and said, "It's to help us gain an appreciation of the experience of reading literature." And he said without hesitation, "Do you think this is possible?" And I said, "I hope so, because this is really expensive." I'm very much my mother's kid.
That's pretty good. Yeah.
But I mean, honestly, what a weird environment. Imagine going to Vogue school to be a carpenter and the teacher's like, So thanks for being here. I cannot teach you how to use any of these tools, and you have no hope of learning how to be a carpenter, you know?
Yeah, right. We're going to talk about the theory of the interrelation
Yeah.
of wood types.
But that being said, I think what this really is, when you and I are high school teachers, hopefully there's some other high school teachers, it isn't bad once in a while in ourselves, with colleagues, or with kids to say, why are we doing this? Why are we talking this way about these texts? So that's really, I think that's what this is. But would you mind if
that's what Wordsworth is doing, right? He's taking a minute out and saying, I've laid something big on the table that's unusual and weird, and it's trying to do something, trying to take a break. And let me tell you why. Let me tell you what I think I'm doing. I wouldn't read almost any literary theory essays that I can think of that I read in college, but I would read this. This is something that I think speaks to the common reader, not just because that's one of his themes, but actually his explanation is talking to actual readers of poetry who he thinks he can speak to, in ordinary language. And it's good, it's actually good, even if you disagree with it. And I don't know this by experience, but in reading about, the break in his friendship with Coleridge, I heard Coleridge has a refutation of this whole thing and just kind of
he eviscerated Wordsworth.
Yeah. I don't know that evisceration, but I still like this, and I want to move on to reading Coleridge, but I like what Wordsworth lays out here. It's worth knowing. And I'll throw in there one other motivation for me for this is, and I think this applies a lot to high school, like this lands for a lot of high school teachers very specifically, which is you commonly set out to represent the Romantic movement. You try to talk about what Romanticism is. And I read a lot of these definitions and explanations of the Romantic movement. And there's all this sort of clever, cartoonish YouTube videos on what is Romanticism. But you can, and I think, Jay, this corresponds a great deal with what we're trying to do here at Teacher Talk, which is you can go back to primary texts on Romanticism. It's a confusing morass of proposed explanations and definitions. Well, why not hear, when you get it, why not hear one of the preeminent Romanticists tell you what Romanticism is actually about?
Right.
You can read this. You don't
if he's even sure, actually.
have to do interpretations or whatever, but you read it and you can read the lines, read between the lines, and figure out what they thought they were doing. And it doesn't give you, in the era of Google and AI, I always want this comprehensive view, something that literally is crunching these large language models across thousands of pages and then puts it down in little bullet points for me. But I don't think that's a good habit to go along with. Yeah. It's not. And so you think, I'll read Wordsworth's one little essay, but it's just one essay. What about all the other things? Well, I don't know about those large, digestive crunches of text. It's so much better to dig in instance by instance, I think, text by text, and learn with the actual practitioners of whatever it is you're trying to learn. In this case, Romanticism, what they actually thought that they were doing. And this is that. This preface is a great place to go.
Yeah.
Get in your mind some definition, some understanding of what Romanticism is about. So I want to throw that out there too.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Let me start with a poem that spoke to me. It's
You got a poem?
It's probably Seamus Heaney's most anthologized poem, and it has some sort of, it was published in 1966. It's called Digging. It's the poem that, if anybody's read anything by Seamus Heaney, it's usually this. And it felt sort of spiritually connected to Lyrical Ballads. So it's called Digging by Seamus Heaney. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father, digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I will dig with it.
Amazing. That's a perfect poem.
Right?
That is, I think it would bring tears to Wordsworth's eyes.
I'm 100% with you.
It would. He said,
100% with you.
I've succeeded. My movement, what I attempted, is alive and well. In 1966, an unimaginable decade for William Wordsworth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic. It does all the things. Through the ordinary, the small. You can't get smaller than digging potatoes.
Yeah, I know.
A family legacy of digging potatoes.
Yeah, yeah.
The family. So it's the smallest of the small. And in it, there's all the grandeur of family and time and sympathy, but also discontinuity, everything. It was beautiful. It was really beautiful.
I thought you'd like that, Paul.
Yeah.
Paul and I were chatting about the fact that a text like this doesn't lend itself to our normal format. So we're going to just sort of talk about how he starts and maybe what his thesis is and just maybe some of the ways he tries to define things. And right, Paul, like we're not going to do our normal, like, here's a passage that stands out, because that's just really, this isn't a literary text. You know what I mean? We have to break down what's being discussed here in a different way.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's break down. Let's get, why did he write this? What is being discussed? What's his theory? What's his idea?
Yeah.
And I might like to tack on, at some point, either in the middle of that or at the end, what are some takeaways for romanticism?
Yeah.
That for me, I like a lot. This is a guide rail, for moving through teaching about romanticism. So, yeah. What do you have for thesis? What is he doing here? Why is he doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I have the fact that it wasn't part of the original publication and it needed to be suggests that there needed to be a defense of poetry like Tintern Abbey and Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. That those of you who are English teachers listening to this or students, it is really hard. I have not succeeded teaching romantic poetry without a bit of a nod to 18th century poetry, because romantic poetry is such a response to it. Right. So I'll often do a little bit of Pope, and I'm not saying days and days. I'll just show some passages of how the poetry was built, heroic couplets, but even just its insistence on order and symmetry and reason and things like that. And just what people like Mary Wollstonecraft and later Coleridge and Wordsworth and Blake, they're really, to use an anachronistic phrase, rolling a grenade into poetry. And when I talk to students about it, I'll say, music has this. I was a kid listening to hair bands, and then Nirvana comes out, the hair bands go out of business. The Beatles try to get signed. Everybody said, no, we're not signing guitar bands. Then the Beatles became a thing, and there was a gazillion bands just like them. Mozart reinvented and perfected the symphony. And you could just take any sort of musical form and say, oh my God, look at this reinvention of a thing because this person showed up. This is very much what Wordsworth is, Wordsworth and Coleridge. And I always found it weird, and I don't know the answer. I probably should have researched it. Coleridge, in many respects, had the more philosophical mind. And you see that reading Biographia Literaria. It's a much more thorough text philosophically, and it's much more rigorously argued. Wordsworth, to be perfectly honest, is all over the place. I mean, it sort of reminds me like, it's like Whitman saying, a foolish consistency is a hobgoblin of little minds, like which is great. Like, sorry, I told you the paper was due on Thursday. It's actually due Friday, because I don't have a little mind. So I find it interesting, and you can go down the rabbit hole and get sort of trapped there. But just to give students a sense that, like, oh my gosh, you want to know what a poem looked like in 1770? It's this. Because here's the thing, like, Wordsworth comes out of the gate and ends the preface, I would argue, a bit hesitatingly. He says, I'm advised to prefix a systematic defense of the theory upon which the poems were written. And he said, I might be suspected of having been principally influenced by the selfish and foolish hope of reasoning him, that reader, into an approval of these poems. And then, but they're so different, he says, that it would be inappropriate to try to argue my way. So he's beginning an argumentative text by saying, no argument can justify the thing where you're about to read, all these poems. So he's setting himself up, sort of acknowledging the complexity of this preface itself. It's kind of a really gutsy introduction.
It's true. And he is aware. He's aware he's not an analytical philosopher. He's aware he's not consistent. He's aware because he says in several places, if a more thoroughgoing, or a couple places I can remember, if a more thoroughgoing account were given, I would have started with this and I would have defined that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm just going to get to the point.
Yep.
Not to mention the fact that he thinks the power of language is not really rooted in systematic analytical representations of scientific knowledge. He talks about the sciences, right? He talks about scientific knowledge. It's legitimate. It's a real human thing, but it's not what he's going for. It's not where he thinks what he's doing is at, anyway.
Right.
So you're right. So you got to come with that in mind, right? You're not moving through it. This would not be easy to outline. I didn't try to do it, but I don't know that I'd want to.
So I just want to point out what his thesis literally is.
All right. Yeah.
And then I just want to suggest that there's a tension he presents that I think is basically the root tension of anybody that reads or thinks about literature seriously. So his thesis is it's 3 parts: to choose, quote, incidents and situations from common life, especially common and rustic life. And again, if you're publishing poetry now, if you open up the Paris Review or even a college poetry literary magazine, it's people's common everyday experiences. It would be really hard actually to get published writing a poem called Essay on Criticism or On Justice or whatever. So the Romantics talking about common life, I would argue, are the reason why any poet gets published now. So the second thing is to describe common life using the language really used by men. And then third, to throw over the poetry a certain coloring of imagination where ordinary things could be presented in an unusual aspect. So it's, what are we talking about? Everyday stuff. How are we talking about it? Regular language. And then there's this sort of, he sidesteps for a while what it really is, but there's enough literary language in there that it's not what you would say in a pub.
Yes, right. Or
So
metrical, like meter. That word kept coming up. He's marrying this language to meter. That's his concession to why this is lyrical, why it's not prose.
Right.
Essentially.
Yeah. So in terms of, I wrote down like a bunch of quotes about what he says about poetry. Many of them are very famous. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Poetry is emotion, recollected tranquility. And then stuff about the poet that, it's fine. We get it. That's sort of a romantic sort of ethos. But I find a tension, and I bet you have this experience in class too, where you're reading a poem or a text you love, and there's a thing in every teacher. I'll speak for myself, and I'm guessing it's for every teacher, where you can move the conversation to a romantic direction, or you could acknowledge sort of how the thing's built.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think it's perfectly binary, but Wordsworth basically talks a lot, and Shelley amps this up later in his defense of poetry. He's even more hyperbolic than Wordsworth is. He refers to poets as the unacknowledged legislators of the world.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Wordsworth has a line pretty close to that.
He does, yeah. So there are moments where we have this sense that I don't think Wordsworth would say this, because you get the sense that he's catching himself. I don't think he would. Wordsworth studied Latin and Greek and read Shakespeare and knew Shakespeare and Milton by heart. It isn't a coincidence he can sit and write Tintern Abbey or The Solitary Reaper or any of his great poems. It isn't simply that he has feelings, because philosophically, not everybody with strong feelings can write good poetry. Right. But the definitions he lays out are rooted in feelings. And then he mentions meter. And so I find as an English teacher, you can go down the road of, let's say it's the sonnet, Julia and Romeo speak to each other, if I profane with my unworthiest hand, right? That sonnet.
Yeah.
You can just talk about, and I think it's good, right? We could say, oh my gosh, imagine you meet this girl at a party, of course you're going to go there. The kids have never read it and they're 14. You got to humanize it, right? But isn't it also good to say, hey, look at how he built this?
Yeah.
Right? So I find, and I'll stop talking in a sec, but I find that the central tension of teaching literature is embodied in this preface, because he wants to acknowledge the emotional strength of literature that even Plato knew, which is why he banished the poets from the Republic in Book 10. he knew the magical, mystical power that literature could
Yes.
have over people. While at the same time, Wordsworth is smart enough to know that there are sort of metrical and structural realities that make great poetry great, not just feelings. So I find that this preface acknowledges that tension, never resolves it, isn't a great work of philosophy, but I think it acknowledges something that's extremely real and important.
Yeah, that's good. And yeah, it's not great philosophy, but it's very good to hear an excellent poet, a poet who you will read and enjoy, articulate what he thinks he's doing. Don't you want to hear him have this conversation?
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
I want to be in those dinner parties, and hear him say it. So that's good I've got your sort of A, B, and C. I didn't get your third part down very well, but for the thesis, the big thesis he's saying is this is poetry. This in this preface, Lyrical Ballads is poetry that focuses on common life. He wants to get back to ordinary life, like digging potatoes, because he thinks that's where vitality lives.
Yeah.
And that's in contrast to the neoclassical or the classical ancient poets. He said, they wrote about great events. Well, the ancients said wrote about great events, Iliad and Odyssey kind of things. But then the imitators, he doesn't use that word, but that's what he means. The poets who were the standard of his day, who he finds dry and dead and lost. He says they're trying to recreate great events. They're not actual, great events they're writing about, but they're trying to sort of conjure that up, even though they don't know anything about great events. They haven't lived through them. And so it's not real. It's not vital. It's not. So one, common life. Where are you going to get back to common life? Or where are you going to get back to real feeling and intensity is back in common life, I think. And then B is common language. So he doesn't like this stuffy, high diction formalism that he thinks kills and squashes authentic feeling, right? I think that's your point B. And then what's the third point you said? I have
third is his concession that I'm paraphrasing. It's his concession that poetry isn't language spoken in a pub only, or language with feelings attached. Right. He quotes, I want to throw over, quote, throw over onto poetry, quote, a certain coloring of imagination where ordinary things should be presented in an unusual aspect. And then later it's prosody and meter. And so he acknowledges basically that it's a mix of the ordinary structured in a not ordinary way.
That's right.
That's something that's very rarely discussed. There's a couple of quotes here that are sort of iconic. The ones I quoted earlier.
Yes,
but
I got those down too.
If you go and read Lyrical Ballads or anything by Wordsworth, it sounds like, I guarantee you in 1798, no one talked this way. Yeah. No one did. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's important. I mean, even if you watch good television now, if you watch Breaking Bad, it's incredibly artfully done. And I know it's in regular speech, but kind of, right? I mean, but it's highly dramatic, artfully done.
Yeah.
So I don't know. So it's a mix of
No, I totally agree. In the ordinary poems in the sort of realist American tradition of drama or something, Death of a Salesman has these unbelievably elevated scenes in it. I'd say the funeral scene, for Willie, the language is almost Shakespearean, so there's this elevated nature. So he does concede to that. So common life, get back to real feelings where the soul and an above average perceiver or feeler of life will touch down. Two, will speak in common language. You don't have to have this. It's not just refined language. He says poetry had begun like subcultures do. They develop their own sort of terminology. It had just wandered off into its own language. It wasn't even related to how people actually spoke. So poets are writing to each other. It's kind of like reading literary theory, like you were talking about earlier, in a journal. That's not written to humans. That's written to other people majoring in literary theory. And they're the only ones that read it, if anyone ever does. He seems to think that's what poetry became. So he wanted to bring it back down to real people, real language. And then that third thing, he does concede, well, I'm not doing prose. And he has a section in the essay, right? He says, well, how come I just didn't write this in prose? Or how come I didn't just write prose? How come Lyrical Ballads isn't lyrical essays or something? And he concedes that marrying meter to this regular subject matter with regular language makes it more. I mean, one line I remember him saying, he says anyone will agree with this. All right, so everyone has to agree. Anyone would agree with this. If I wrote exactly what I said in paragraphs in prose or I wrote exactly what I said in verse, you would read the verse 100 times over and the paragraph only once. He says, that's just obviously true, he says. So he just says it's more pleasant. And he does go into why it's more pleasant. He has some neat thoughts about that.
Yeah.
And pleasure is a big thing in this, giving the pleasure that poets can give. He said that's our responsibility, and there is a pleasure in the metrical marriage of or the marriage of meter to words. So those are good. That's good. That gets you a long way in this. The common life, the common language married to the poetic artisticness, which he says just makes a difference. So that's a great start. And so he's going to stand on that ground. I like those quotes you had about poetry, the spontaneous. I think you have to have those down. Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. But I like marrying it with that other quote, not just feelings, but recollected, those feelings recollected in tranquility. I really like that. And then composed exactly like you just described from amongst common experience in ordinary language with some poetic artfulness, primarily meter. And that's all done by a person who has great sensitivity. I don't know. He doesn't define the poet a lot more different than that, than just a person with capacity for sensitivity, for feeling, I think, right?
True. I have this long quote. I don't want to read it, but where he defines the poet. You want to hear some of it where he defines the poet?
Yeah. Let's get the poet. So we got the poetry. We got the poetry a little bit, but who's this person who can do it?
Yeah.
Who's the poet?
And it always reminds me of like Sonnet 18, like this poem I'm writing for you will last forever as long as men can breathe or eyes can see. So long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Yeah. It's a poet writing that, Paul. It's like it's in your best interest to think your work lives forever. So this is a poet saying a poet is, quote, a man speaking to men, a man, it is true, endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature and you can hear Plato saying, oh my God, absolutely not. And a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. Yeah. A man pleased with his own passions and volitions, and who rejoices more than other men in the spirit of life that is in him, delighting to contemplate similar volitions and passions as manifested in the goings on of the universe, and habitually impelled to create them where he does not find them. To these qualities he's added a disposition to be affected more than other men by absent things as if they were present, an ability of conjuring up in himself passions which are indeed far from being the same as those produced by real events, yet, especially in those parts of the general sympathy which are pleasing and delightful, do more nearly resemble the passions produced by real events than anything which, from the motions of their own minds merely, other men are accustomed to feel in themselves. Whence and from practice he has acquired a greater readiness and power in expressing what he thinks and feels, and especially those thoughts and feelings which, by his own choice or from the structure of his own mind, arise in him without immediate external excitement.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there.
There is. There's a capacity thing, like it is pretty wordy, but there's a capacity thing, an uncommon soul that can recreate without actually having to be at the sunset, I guess.
Sure.
In tranquility, the quiet.
As one does,
Yeah. You don't have to be sitting in front of it writing the poem, but this soul has the ability to recreate those emotions that they did feel at some point. I mean, in nature, and the nature connection is crucial, I think. But I like that, the acquired readiness and capacity or ability. To put all this down, in words.
He almost says something incredibly interesting in terms of meter and like a formal approach. Those people, and I'm a musician, so I think of musicians when I think this, who don't necessarily know theory. They just know how to make music amazingly well. They can't necessarily explain it. I'm a big Stevie Ray Vaughan guy. It's not like he ever studied guitar, but I love Stevie Ray Vaughan's guitar playing. Yeah. And even friends of mine that teach guitar who went to Berkeley and studied say, he was on another level. So there's some sense that, Wordsworth clearly studied meter, clearly had drunk in people like Milton and Shakespeare. So he clearly knows poetic music and how to play with it. And he says this is about the pleasure readers derive from well-structured poetic meter. Yeah. Pleasure which the mind derives from the perception of similitude in dissimilitude. Yeah. And I think of like any piece of music or poetry I mean, until World War I really had a regular music, right? We just did Homer, and that's originally in dactylic hexameter. Since Chaucer, the English line for the most part is iambic pentameter. So we always say like Shakespeare's sonnets are written in iambic pentameter. Well, they're not really. I mean, probably less than 10% of the lines are iambic pentameter, but there's 10 syllables in a line, and the basic backbeat is da-dum, 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 da-dum. And there's I think it's 73 that begins with that time of year thou mayest in me behold. So it begins with the backbeat. So that's sort of the pattern. And then he immediately varies it. Yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon the boughs that shake against the cold, bare, ruined choirs. So there's this sense that like Wordsworth knows that really what poets are doing with sound is creating a pattern and then breaking it in a way to make you notice stuff.
Yes.
In really interesting ways. So that's a very structural statement. That isn't you and I talking in a pub.
Right.
That's an artist maybe he's taking emotion recollected in tranquility, but then crafting it. And part of me wishes someone said to Wordsworth, write a few more pages about how you do that, because you're really good at that. So what is it when you burst with emotions onto the page, and you probably can write first drafts better than most people write final poems? What's your revision process like that acknowledges what you want the structure to be, not just the feelings to express?
Yeah. That would have been nice to hear more about, but it felt like, and I shouldn't say this because I don't know his writing well enough to say, but it felt like it was stressing him, just like that definition of the poet you were giving. He's like bending over backwards to try to define what this poet is without saying he's this classically trained person, who has, essentially a formal degree in writing poetry, which he thinks is awful. But it's like this whole capacity kind of thing. I thought it was nice. So also in in defining what's pleasurable about the poetry, which you were just talking about, that he landed on relationship, essentially on similitude and difference. And that a lot of poetry comes down to that. And it's true. I had my students write about that. They did an analysis of poetry. They did an analysis paper this year, and 3 of their development paragraphs had to be, one was rhyme scheme and meter. They had to focus on how the meaning was created with rhyme scheme and meter.
Excellent.
And then another paragraph, how the meaning was created with literary devices. We pulled out 20 literary devices, and then they analyzed. And then third, also, we just did grammar. But in each of those, what it came down to was tricks for making you pay attention to things. And it's sort of an on and off, a similar, a difference. We're going down this path, a juxtaposition of sames or juxtapositions of surprising differences or something.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of neat that he went, it seemed, I don't know, daring to me to go that far and say it all comes down to similitude. That's more than I would say, but Wordsworth said it, and it's worth thinking about. But that's him trying to say, why is meter, why is the poetic form more pleasant? He says the mind enjoys it, right? There's a line, he says the mind takes pleasure in the recognition of similitude.
And we know that because there's no song of note. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Great American Songbook. If you said you could have one kind of music, it would be Porter, Gershwin, Rogers, and Hart. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm a 105-year-old man. No, I just give me Ella Fitzgerald, give me Frank Sinatra, Nat Cole, all those people all day long. But if you take It Had to Be You, It Had to Be You, that last note I sang twists it. You have this little pattern of an interval, and then it sounds flat, but it's perfect. It's hard to describe. And you could do this with any really great song. There's like a pattern, and then a really interesting set of variations to the pattern. Now, something that I mentioned to my seniors more than my freshmen is, and I suggest this to colleagues when it's appropriate, is the thing about prosody or meter is that it takes poetry out of the realm of this like mysterious, opaque, everything is symbolic conversation, which just scares the crap out of people and makes them not want to read it. To saying, no, this is what's literally here, no matter who you are reading it. Like this music is inherent in the thing. It's not about your response to it. Like, you know what I mean? And you can
entirely. And I use that. I wanted to drive, because my students they let themselves, and all of us do this probably, you let yourself off the hook, with poetry. Like, well, it could mean anything, essentially. And I'm like, well, okay, maybe it inspires something in you, but what's actually on the page?
Yeah.
What is the similarity and difference? What is
Sure.
being built here? Because the poet is turning the camera, is pointing the camera in various directions, and it because of these elements. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of, in terms of like, can we get to like questions or things we're thinking about, like takeaways? Are we there yet?
Yeah, I think we're close. So we have the thesis of what Lyrical Ballads is about, what it's trying to do. What is poetry? We kind of have the spontaneous overflow, recollected in tranquility, married to some metrical norms, some poetic norms, because the mind likes it. And so the mind is attracted to it. It takes pleasure in it. It's not didactic. It's reflective. And then what is the poetry itself? It's the ordinary life, and it's found in simple things, and it's also found in nature. Wordsworth said part of his motivation for doing this was, I think this is a line that maybe people from all generations and all times, however you define it, could feel sympathy with. He said there's such political upheaval in our time, and there accumulation of men in cities.
I wrote that down. Yeah.
You write that down? Yeah, that's our time. Can't you sell that to students? Give them.
Well, even like he connects that to people, the uniformity of people's occupations and experiences. And to me, when you see kids, and your kids have been affected by this, as of mine, the arts, once a kid gets plugged in and inspired by the arts, it is such a literally countercultural choice to write music, to make music, to sit out by the campfire, play guitar and sing, learn something on the piano, be in a show. Like, it is so opposite of the internet algorithms we're trapped in and everything else. Like, even more.
Exactly. Like substitute, conglomerations of people moving into cities and living urban, suburban lives. We do have that, but layer on top of that, the internet, right? The algorithmic life.
Yeah.
That fits in perfectly. And it's a way out. It's a way out.
Totally.
You're right. It's so countercultural. Totally. How do you get out of that? And when you read poetry, you try to write it, or drama or music, you realize you're listening to way too much politics. You're doing way too much of this, just uniformity. You're just being guided by a market and by a political system that at best is binary, and it's probably not even that. And it's just hurting you into a corner. So here's a way out. And Wordsworth said, I myself would have I would be in despair about how bad things are, except for two things. And I think this is core. So this is back to your question, what's the core things before we get to those final takeaways? I think this core thing is the marriage of the mind and nature. He finds this continuity between the two. So he says, I think there are these essential capacities, I guess you'd say, or qualities of the mind that you find, and then they get acted on by these great permanent objects, I think is a phrase he uses. And I think as he's talking about nature, these realities, that there is a reality, and and your mind stubs its toe against it over and over. And it's that interaction. And I think he thinks it's an even closer interaction, an even closer coordination, because he says something like the mind is the mirror of nature. It reflects the deeper realities of nature. And so there's this wild contiguity between the two. And that might help explain, speaking of politics, why he and Coleridge and everyone became really conservative.
Right.
Politicians have this sense of the sense of reality in the end. And you're seeking to know it, and you're seeking to know the truth and to find it and to represent it. Even though what he's doing, as you emphasized at the beginning, is throwing a stick of dynamite into tradition. He doesn't start off in that conservative mode in the sense of tradition. He's kind of an iconoclast, but with the purpose of preserving poetry, because he thinks poetry is broken, and he needs a revolution. He needs a reformation. Like you say, you need the Kurt Cobain to show up and just blow up the hairbands, because music's being ruined. It's being.
I want to suggest there's no other podcast on the internet that has connected Wordsworth and Nirvana, and we're it.
Yeah, so there's at least that. You can give us a thumbs up for that.
There's that.
At least. And it's funny, and it's also not. Like the Romanticism, it is the way out. it's continual cycle of revolution and reformation and then preservation and that's beyond the scope of this, of what we're talking about tonight. But it's ever present. It's present with us, and its project of trying to get back to reality is something I think all generations, all times have to do. And so it's a great model for that. So he says that poetry is an image of man and nature. He says you're shooting for reality is you're trying to find that authentic. He had this other phrase, the poet is trying to find the emanations of nature more than the artifice of poetry. Drop what you learned in poetry school if you've heard, and he says the emanations of, if you've heard nature speak, if you've captured some element of reality like spontaneously, that's the thing you need to write down. And everything else can be thrown away. Forget heroic couplets, forget, the poetry dictionary or literary devices. All that can be tossed because, the poet, plays this special role of finding reality and binding together the empire of society. Binding together the empire of society plays this huge role. All right, so I think we've laid that out. What is this thesis for Lyrical Ballads? What is poetry? What is the poet? Where does the motive and the I think the fuel for the poetry comes from its mind and nature, in constant interaction, and that I think is a beautiful representation of the poetry he's doing. I think. So maybe with that, we're ready to move. Did you want to do some like takeaways then to wrap this up?
Yeah, I want to make sure it's not bad to read this stuff as a philosophical exercise, and you and I could nerd out forever doing that. And I think we did a good job talking about the text itself. I think I'm just trying to think of if you're an English teacher, what in this text could you incorporate into your teaching of poetry?
Yeah.
And to me, one of the things is acknowledging the importance of tranquility, that our students do not have lots of space and quiet. I think to have what you and I were never given as students, and even probably 10 or 20 years ago, kids weren't given as students, but to say, okay, everybody go to the bathroom so you don't have to go to the bathroom. I don't know if it's at your school, but everybody drinks water all day at my school and they all go to the bathroom 100 times a day. So we're going to sit for half an hour and read poetry, and you're not going to get quizzed. You're just going to sit, or you're going to everybody here's a prompt and just write about it and let your mind wander. I just don't think we allow people space to imagine and think, because it isn't just emotion, it's recollected. That's an intellectual activity, and tranquility is an intentional context that you craft for yourself on purpose. And there is not a lot of it. So if we're not careful, things like reading imaginative literature in general are going to be literally impossible if we don't occasionally create space. And I'm not saying we read everything aloud in class. I'm not for that either. But I think with poetry, to have space to read it, quiet to think and journal, wonder, I think Wordsworth encourages us to allow for that. And I'm reminded that, and you and I have had this conversation, one of the blessings of being a teacher and an avid reader is we get to read and reread things we love, and they change because we change. So I don't read Hamlet the way I did 20 years ago. I've lost my father. It's very different. I have a different sensibility. I'm a different person. I believe in some different things. I think of Yo-Yo Ma, who has had a lifelong passion for Bach's the cello, the concertos, whatever they are. And you can get videos of him doing them in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. What is there? But he said in interviews well, I'm different. I change. So if I'm different, my relationship to the art's different. But I mean, I think when you're talking about teaching in a regular high school environment, I mean, do they have space to think like that? I don't think they're incapable of thinking that way. I think they're just pinballed from thing to thing really fast, and we have to get these assessments in. So to me, what Wordsworth reminds me of as a teacher is every once in a while, stop and give them space. And honor questions, even like the honoring of an emotional response to a literary text. He would say, no, do that. If a kid is overwhelmed by a paragraph in a Cormac McCarthy novel, have him write about with the I voice. What are you feeling? What's overwhelming? I think Wordsworth would want me to do that. and not make everything this anesthetized, just repeated 5-paragraph essay.
It's such a great point. And I'll build off of that because he closes out the essay kind of in reflection on the power of language. He says, I think we underestimate what language can do. It can do the things I'm talking about. It can do a lot more too. And it can even it goes into the role it can play in the sciences to help humanize the sciences and make those things a part of the human experience too, and not just a rarefied activity that specialists are doing, which is fine to do. But a poet has a role to play in those things too, and it's in the power of language. And we don't live in the age of language. We live in the age of images. We don't believe in the power of language. We believe in the power of images. That's our students' native experience. It's our native experience. And so to take what you just said really seriously, I mean, I was struck by it all year this year. We're at the end of our school year. I'm in exams right now, and I pressed. In each of my classes, we read 2 or 3 more novels than I did last year because I did what you said. I gave class time over to it. I read out loud some, but mostly I was just coach in the room. Keep reading. Can you do 10 more pages? We have 15 minutes. I bet you can make it. Need to go to the bathroom, come back. And just read. And final exams this week, we're just writing. Again, just write. Just get lost. It's an hour-and-a-half period. I gave them a prompt, 3 different novels. And one student came up to me this morning. She said, I've been thinking about this prompt all weekend long. She said, my sister, she was 10. She had a birthday party. I was supposed to be like the lifeguard of the pool. There are 15, 10-year-olds there. And the whole time I'm thinking, I gave them this prompt that these 3 novels are really the same novel.
So she got an A and 2 kids drowned. That's great, Paul.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, whatever. Small price to pay. She was reflecting on these novels throughout the weekend. And that's what you want to hear.
Yeah.
Like it got into her head. And there was some tranquility, there that she found through her busy weekend to reflect and to think, because she had read and was given a prompt that kind of landed for her in some way, or maybe she was worried about her grade, whatever. But I think, we like to complain and blame, state standards or blame the principals or whatever, and they're worth all the blame you can give. But it's us too. We need to do it. It doesn't feel like it's enough somehow.
Yep.
But to read, to reflect, to read poetry. But what if Wordsworth is right? What if our kids untaught will take pleasure in similitude and dissimilitude, will take pleasure in poetry? What if he's right that there is an indestructible quality of the mind, and there are these great permanent objects in nature that our students, without our teaching, they don't need a PowerPoint from us in order to get them. In fact, they won't get them with a PowerPoint. What if he's right? Then they need to read. They need to come up against it and experience their capacity of mind, experience these great realities represented lyrically or fictionally, and give them that experience. I'm overwhelmed with the need for that. And I think it's a fantastic takeaway. And we need to do it as teachers.
Right.
We need to do it. It's not beneath our class time. We're not like, we'll take a day off, let's read. That's not a day off. That's the day. That's primary class.
And Wordsworth and Coleridge went to the Lakes region, and if you went away from the city, you had a sort of intentional solitude and quiet and isolation. But with the smartphone, there is no Lakes region anymore. Like, you have to do other things. But I don't want to I don't want to talk about COVID anymore with my students. Like, we're done. We're good.
Yeah.
You can do homework now. It's okay. You're fine.
Yeah.
But it's similar, I don't want to just keep bitching about the cell phone. Like, there are people, when you're playing soccer, you're not on your cell phone. When you're acting in the play or with your band, you're not on we do make choices not to be on it. And so you do have control.
Right.
And I hear Wordsworth is a voice that I think is reminding us that any serious reading of literature in general, not just poetry, of music. I mean, I sometimes I always start class with a poem, but sometimes it's a piece of music. And kids will often say, they listen to more music than any group of people in human history, right? But they're very rarely just listening to music. They're listening to music and exercising and driving and doing things. So just the act of sitting and listening and just sitting there for 3 or 5 minutes.
Yeah. It's an example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
They kind of listen to music, but they kind of don't, like you're saying. It's background. You're not actually listening to it. Like, you sit down and do it like you're going jogging.
Yeah.
It's not the same. So giving them that experience, whatever. And apparently Coleridge comes along and, and destroys this essay, and fine, good for him. And he's no doubt a much better philosophic writer than Wordsworth. However, there is an inspiration in this. There's a truth that has pervaded art and society to our own time. It's not hard to find that through line. It's not a stretch at all.
Not at all.
To say that Wordsworth, okay, you can congratulate Coleridge for having better arguments, but I think Wordsworth was kind of right. And what he's talking about here for finding reality and finding meaning and regaining art, really nothing less than that has been done through these forms that he lays out here. However scattershot and half developed they are.
Yeah. Fair.
It's a pleasure. Well, okay. I think it's a good take on Lyrical Ballads. We were both reading from the 1800 version of editions, an early one, a slightly later one, but this one's pretty good. It's a great place to go to begin to answer the question. I think we said that during the Odyssey. If you have questions about the gods, you can go to Wikipedia, or you can go to the passage in the Odyssey and find out. This is kind of a version of that. If you want to know what the Romantic movement is about, Wordsworth talks about it, and you can find out here in 10 pages or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So it's good. Jay, thanks.
Thanks, Paul.
Appreciate your reflections. It was good to hear.
Yeah.
And thanks for that poem to begin with. There couldn't have been a more perfect
Wordsworthian
Wordsworth-worthy poem than Digging by Seamus Heaney.
Yeah.
All right.
Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too, and catch up with you next time.
All right, see you, Paul.